Hi, my name is Lee Gitzis. I'm the Chief Virtualization and Storage Architect for Com Solutions Company. Welcome to the first edition of Virtualization Tech Tips. Today we're going to demonstrate the configuration of the new Citrix HTML5 receiver. This new clientless receiver allows a Citrix session to run natively in a web browser without the Citrix receiver client. This is a vast improvement over the Java client, which has been available in the past. Today we're going to deploy this for a XenApp environment. Before we begin, there are several components that must be installed and configured prior to the installation and configuration of this new HTML5 receiver. We're going to first switch over to the desktop of our XenApp server. For our demonstration today, all of the required components will be installed on a single Windows 2008 R2 server. This includes XenApp management and application delivery components, the license server, the data store, and the Citrix storefront, as well as the HTML5 receiver. In a production environment, it is recommended that the aforementioned components are all installed on separate, dedicated server resources. This is to ensure performance and scalability. XenApp must be installed at version 6.5 to support the web receiver. In addition, it must also have 6.5 hotfix rollup 1 installed at a minimum. An applicable Citrix Group Policy Management update is also required for enabling the functionality of the HTML5 receiver. In addition to XenApp 6.5, the Cloud Gateway Express or the Citrix Storefront must be leveraged. The Citrix Storefront is the future replacement for the web interface and is required to run the web-based receiver. Installation and configuration of this will also be demonstrated during this video. The Citrix HTML5 receiver client is required and will be installed on this IIS server. This is required because the client is now projected through the browser rather than running locally on the receiver client. On our server, we have deployed Citrix licensing. On the Citrix licensing, we've deployed a trial license of Zen Desktop, which gives us evaluation licenses through March that will enable us to be able to use the functionality of our XenApp server. In addition to that, we've installed XenApp 6.5, and we've provisioned a farm called Test Farm. We've also published a shared desktop that we will use for demonstration purposes. In conjunction with deploying XenApp licensing, and as we mentioned before, the Citrix Data Store, which is deployed on SQL Server 2008 R2 Express on this same server as well, we need to deploy a few other components. The first one will be the XenApp 6.5 hotfix rollup 1 package, which is the MSI that I just highlighted here. We also have the Citrix Group Policy Management update, which will give us the functionality to be able to configure the Citrix HTML5 receiver. We have the Citrix Storefront, which is also known as the Citrix Cloud Gateway Express. This is the eventual replacement for the Citrix web interface and is required to enable the HTML5 client functionality. We will install and configure this, and then we will finally deploy the HTML5 HDX engine, which is the actual receiver. It is an HTML5 component that gets configured within an IIS and enables the server to render the images. To begin, we're going to launch the hotfix rollup for XenApp 6.5. Wizard will begin the installation process. We'll click Next and begin the install. The installation process takes about 10 minutes, so we're going to pause the video and resume once it's completed. The installation is completed. Once you acknowledge that it's finished, it will ask you to reboot the server. Click OK and reboot, and then resume once the server is back up and operational. The reboot has completed, and we've logged back into our desktop. The next component of the configuration will be the Citrix Group Policy Management Console. When we double-click the MSI, the installation begins. It quickly runs through the installation and the update, first by removing an older version, then deploying the new. And the update is complete. Note that there will be no notification or wizard or any type of screen that will indicate you kicking it off or ending and acknowledging the installation. It simply runs through a scripted update. So now we've got XenApp 6.5 deployed to the proper maintenance release level. We've got the updated Group Policy Management Console deployed. So now we need to configure the Citrix storefront to get access to our resources. So we're going to double click the Citrix storefront installer. The storefront configuration wizard will appear, and the first step will be to accept the license agreement and click next. It's going to detect that the required roles for IIS are not deployed, and it's going to deploy them for us. So we'll click next. It's going to confirm what we need to install. So again, IIS, and then following that will be all the storefront components. And we'll click install to begin the installation process. Again, we're going to pause the video and we will resume once installation is complete. The installation has completed, and if successful, it will confirm that every component has been deployed. Upon clicking finish, it should launch the Citrix Storefront Management MMC console. And it will bring us to a server deployment wizard. So we're presented with three options. We can deploy a single server, we can deploy a multiple server group, or join an existing group. For our example today, we're going to do a single server. In a production environment, we would likely want to have a multiple server group, which we would be front-ending with a load balancer such as a NetScaler in order to provide fault tolerance and load balancing for the resources that are going to connect through the storefront. We can also join an existing group. So if we say start with a single server, we could bolt in a second one and achieve the configuration of the multiple server group without having to start over. So we're going to start with a single server, and it's going to ask us a couple questions. The first is, what is the location of this server? By default, it uses the server name, which we're going to use for this example. We're going to use a local environment with internal DNS. So we're just going to change that to be the fully qualified name of our server, and our domain is test.com. We're going to use HTTP, which is causing this warning message because it's just alerting us that if we don't use SSL, we're not going to have encrypted communication. So once we've typed the name, we'll click Create, and it's going to create the server deployment. A wizard will come up to create a store. The store is what the Citrix receiver presents for users to be able to access their virtual desktops, their shared desktops, their published enterprise applications, as well as SaaS applications and native mobile apps. We're going to name our store Test and click Next. And the next question is, what are the delivery controllers presenting these resources? So again, we have a choice. We can have a Cloud Gateway Enterprise controller, which is going to deploy SaaS applications as well as mobile applications, a XenApp deployment, or a Zen desktop deployment. Because we're working with XenApp, we're going to choose a XenApp deployment, and we're going to call this XenApp Test. We're going to add our server that we're connected to. Click OK. If we had multiple XenApp management servers, we would want to add them. Generally, it's best practice to have at least 2, again, for fault tolerance. For this example, we're going to change our transport type to HTTP, and again, you'll see we're going to get warned because we're not using a certificate to encrypt communication. And we're going to click OK. If we needed to add virtual desktops or we wanted to add mobile applications natively and things of that nature, we would just click Add and then add the additional controller types that we need. Click Next. The next question is how are users going to access this remotely? So we have a couple options. The first one is none, which we're going to use today because we're only going to access this internally. We could do no VPN tunnel, which would mean we're going to proxy the connection through an access gateway or NetScaler. Or we would do full tunnel, which means we're going to first establish a tunnel either over IPsec or SSL and then connect to the environment. Once we've made our choice for remote access, we're going to click Create. Upon completion of the setup, it's going to give us information about using the store, what the website is, and how to enable receiver updates. We can click Finish on this screen, and it will fully populate the management console. We can either use wizard-based configuration, or on the left, we can scroll through the different modules. The first module is authentication. So by default, it's configuring it to use username and password, which when I access the web receiver, I'm going to authenticate with my Active Directory credentials. I can also change methods. I can do, obviously, username and password. I can also do domain pass-through. So if I have a client that's connecting only internally on the LAN, I can have it pass through their local machine credentials so they don't have to authenticate twice. And then, of course, pass-through for Citrix Access Gateway, which when we access the Access Gateway, we authenticated the gateway before we enter the private network. That authentication is passed through a token to the Citrix environment, so we only have to authenticate once. In order for proxied remote access to occur, we must enable pass-through from Citrix Access Gateway. Under the Stores section, we'll see the app stores that we created. We can create multiple app stores for multiple use cases. Over on the right-hand side are some of the management options. We can actually dictate the management controllers and change or update what's deploying resources. We can enable remote access. We can manage receiver updates and choose how those updates will be deployed to end users and what agents will be deployed. We can integrate our store with Citrix Online and give access to GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, and GoToTraining. We can also export the configuration file. And one of the key pieces of functionality is to configure legacy support. The Citrix PN Agent client is the Windows version of the client that is used often in LAN environments where workstations will have pass-through authentication so users can log into their workstation and have their published applications appear for them as shortcuts either on their desktop, in their start menu, or both. That is now considered a legacy function. In order for Citrix storefront servers to be able to support this PN agent, we must enable legacy support. The receiver for web is the URL that users will put into their browser to access the Citrix web receiver. The receiver for web is the replacement of the Citrix web interface, and it presents an identical interface as the actual receiver client that we would have on a Windows device or a Mac or a mobile device. Gateways are where we will have all of our remote access gateways listed. As you can see here, there's a message basically saying, until you set up pass-through authentication, we can't even start this process. This is where we would go in if we were to add a NetScaler or some form of ICA proxy later on. And finally, beacons. Beacons are a tool that are used to monitor traffic and understand whether it's coming in from the outside and the inside and how much traffic is being generated by either type of access. At this point, we have successfully configured and deployed the Citrix storefront. We're going to move over to a client machine and now test access. We are now logged into our Windows 8 client. Installed on our client is Google Chrome. To access the HTML5 receiver, Google Chrome or Firefox are required. To date, Internet Explorer is not supported, although it is in the roadmap. We do not have a Citrix receiver client installed as we are attempting to test clientless access. To begin, we're going to launch Google Chrome, which will take us to our desktop and launch the browser. We're going to log in, or we're going to type the URL of our store into the browser, and it's going to take us to an initial screen indicating that we do not have the Citrix receiver client installed. We're going to skip agreeing to the license and installing the client, and we're going to simply click log on. We're going to enter our domain credentials and authenticate. Upon login, it's going to show our published desktop, and since it's the only application we have access to, it's going to attempt to launch it. Because the HTML5 receiver is not configured yet, we are receiving an ICA file. But due to the fact that we do not have a receiver client installed, the file will not launch. However, this test proves that we've set up and configured the Citrix storefront properly. So now we're going to go back to the server and we're going to complete the configuration of the HTML5 receiver. To begin the process of configuring the HTML5 receiver, we must first go into the Citrix App Center. A policy must be configured to allow the connections to the receiver. With XenApp 6 and 6.5, policies can be configured in several different places. Typically in a production environment, we would want to configure it at the Active Directory level. For the demo purposes, we're going to actually configure it at the farm level, which essentially creates a local policy that gets pushed out to all farm servers. We click on the Computer tab. Will bring us a list of all of our policies and configuration options. We're going to create a new policy and name it and click Next. On the left side, we will see a WebSockets option. We want to click Add next to WebSockets Connections, and we want to allow this policy. This will allow two-way communication between browser-based applications and servers without having to allow multiple connections. We want to click OK. The default WebSockets port number is 8008. Typically, we want to leave this as is. If in the event a different port needs to be configured, it may be changed through this policy, and then when the receiver is configured, it may be changed there to match. Please note that this port will not automatically open on the Windows firewall and will need to be configured. We can also configure a WebSockets Trusted Origin server list. So we can identify actual URLs that the users we want accessing the HTML5 receiver come from. For this demo, we're going to allow any origin. We'll click Next. The next thing we need to do is configure a filter and determine what servers or organizational units this is going to apply to. We have to apply this specifically to an OU or a worker group, neither of which we have configured. So we're going to click Next and create the policy. If we browse to the worker groups section within the App Center, we have the option to create a new worker group. We'll name the worker group and choose our source. We can use Active Directory containers, Active Directory server groups, or farm server. In production, Active Directory containers is the most desired way to do it. That way we can simply manage policies and access by moving server objects in and out of OUs. For this demonstration, we're going to use farm server. Click Add and select our server in our farm. Upon completion of the configuration, the worker group will appear in the management console. We can then go back to policies, edit our new policy, click the filter tab, and click Add Worker Group. We click Add and Browse, and the worker group dialog appears. We select our worker group, click OK, complete and acknowledge the configuration. At this point, the farm settings required for the HTML5 receiver access is complete. The final step is to install and configure the HTML5 engine. We double-click the MSI file, accept the license terms, and click Install. Upon completion, under All Programs Citrix, a new folder will appear for managing the HDX engine. When we click on the management console, a dialog appears. We need to enter the storefront server address of the Citrix store that we want accessed from this receiver. If we're unsure of the URL, we can browse to the Receiver for Web section of the Citrix Storefront Manager, and the URL for the store that we want will appear. After typing the URL, click OK. And the configuration will appear in the dialog. You can close out of the management consoles, and the HTML5 receiver is configured. We are now going to switch back to our Windows 8 client and test our configuration. We are now logged back into our Windows 8 client, and we're going to launch Google Chrome again from the desktop. We will enter the URL for our storefront, and again we'll be prompted to install the receiver client. We'll skip the installation, enter our credentials, and authenticate. As before, we'll be presented with the published desktop with a green icon indicating it's attempting to auto-launch. However, in this instance, we notice that it does not try to deploy an ICA file to the client, as it understands now that this particular site is linked to an HTML5 receiver. It understands that if a client does not exist, it will launch the session natively within the browser. When we click on the shared desktop, the session begins. We are now connected to a published shared desktop via XenApp native HTML5 client listly. Thank you for taking the time today to watch this video. I hope it was educational and informative, and I look forward to seeing you for our next video in our series of virtualization tech tips.